Sup guys, Bjorn here. I hope you're all hyped for 9.2. Today we're taking a look at my 9.2 raid DPS predictions in form of a tier list obviously. It's gonna be a ton of fun I think. Now there's a few caveats before we get started. First of all, these are just my opinions, my predictions, so take them with 1-2 grains of salt. I'm obviously gonna be wrong about some stuff here. Secondly, this is PTR, so tuning hasn't happened yet. There's most likely gonna be a balanced tuning for single target when Heroic Week launches. That's usually how Blizzard does it, so I definitely expect some of the specs in D tier, C tier and maybe even B tier to see some single target buffs. Then I just quickly wanted to give an overview of my grading process here, because I'm not really looking too much at the Sepulcher of the first one bosses, and I'm not gonna reference them very much when talking about the individual specs, and that is for a couple of reasons. First of all, we haven't seen the last 3 bosses, so it's hard to speculate on those, and more importantly, in the last couple of years, in the last couple of expansions, Blizzard has gotten really good at just making very varied raid tiers with some AoE, some single target obviously, or a lot of single target rather, but also some AoE, some cleave, some burst needed and stuff like that, so everyone can kind of shine where they have their niche. And usually when you look at Warcraft logs overall damage after a tier, even the specs that don't do very good single target are actually most likely like middle of the pack, because they just have those AoE bosses where they can actually shine. A good example of this would be like Windwalker in the last tiers, for example, not really doing top tier single target, but really important to have for that AoE burst. And I think the same holds true to a certain extent in Sepulcher of the first ones as well. There are several bosses that have adds that needs to die in terms of AoE burst. There's also Prototype of Pantheon, where the boss itself has 4 different bosses. We have a couple of bosses with more adds, such as like Lehivum. And then obviously Anduin, he summons the big Lich King ad, as well as other adds, so there's gonna be a ton of AoE possibilities in this raid as well. This means that I don't really think there's gonna be a massive favor towards good single target or good AoE damage. I think you're gonna need a mix of both in 9.2 as well. Now obviously it's a raid, so there's obviously always gonna be a little bit of a skew towards single target damage. Okay, the last thing I wanted to say here before we get started guys is you definitely need to subscribe down below. Not a lot of you guys watching these tier lists are subscribed, so you should definitely click that button. That will let you know when I upload my 9.2 videos, and it would really help me out as well, so massive thank you to those of you who are subscribed. Alright, let's get straight into the tier list, and we'll start here with Fire Mage. Fire Mage is looking pretty similar to its recent patches in 9.2 I think. It isn't doing any top tier single target, its tier set isn't really great on single target at all, so it falls in a pretty mediocre spot. Now it is still a mage obviously, it gets bonuses for being really tanky, for being very good ranged, mobility, you have the good burst profile obviously as a fire mage as well, so there's a high possibility that you will end up playing fire on some of the fights as a mage here in 9.2, but I would definitely say that it isn't looking very strong in terms of pure single target DPS. The same can be said for Arcane. It also has a really bursty profile, gains a lot of bonus points for being a mage, but in terms of single target damage from the tier set, from the bard power, isn't really top tier in 9.2. A little bit disappointingly, Frost Mage is actually the strongest single target spec in 9.2. Now that is with a huge caveat, because you've got to remember that Frost Mage has a very flat damage profile. You don't really see any big spikes, you don't really see any big bursts when an ad spawns maybe, or there's a big AoE moment coming, or maybe you need some priority damage on something. That can really hurt the Frost Mage viability. That said, I still think it's ahead enough for you to play it on most fights in 9.2, especially since there aren't really a huge amount of like massive AoE burst needed, at least not on the first 8 fights. That said, I still don't think Frost Mage is anywhere near S tier in terms of pure single target damage. It's probably still gonna be somewhat middle of the pack, maybe towards the upper end of the middle of the pack in terms of single target damage, but again, you're gaining a lot of bonus points here for being the best mage spec, for having arcane intellect, being really tanky, etc, etc. Now, I know it can be pretty risky telling jokes over the internet, they don't usually land well, but you've just got to hear this one guys. Affliction single target DPS 9.2. Oh my god. Wait, I have another one, Oh, right here. Oh yeah, I remember it now. Destruction single target DPS in 9.2. Destruction single target DPS 9.2. Oh! Pretty yikes. No, but in all seriousness, I think both Affliction and Destruction are actually quite terrible going into 9.2 raid. First of all, they both have very low baselines in terms of single target DPS. They're probably the 2 worst specs in the game right now, or at least close to it. Affliction doesn't really gain anything from its 4-piece or its 2-piece in single target. It's very small gains, so even as the patch progresses, they are actually not gonna rise very much in single target, and I think it's very likely that with all the 9.2 board power, Affliction ends up being the worst single target in the game, or at least close to it. Now you do have a small niche with Necrolord execute, but I don't think it's going to be big enough to see any play for Affliction on pretty much any of the bosses. Destruction is in a similar spot with its baseline single target. It's absolutely terrible right now. It's probably the worst spec in the game on single target, doing very, very low amounts of DPS. But the Destruction tier set is actually pretty decent on single target as well, even though you think of it as that massive AoE tier set with the Infernals, right? You do actually see a substantial increase in single target as well with the Reign of Chaos build. So I think Destruction is going to end up being a bit better than Affliction as the tier progresses, but it's still going to be one of the lower single target specs in the game, and definitely not something you would want to bring to most bosses in 9.2. Demonology is the shining light of the Warlock, and it's not really strong, don't get me wrong here. It's actually doing pretty mediocre in terms of DPS, similar to Fire Mage and Arcane Mage, right? Not anything special here. You also have a very wonky damage profile with the Tyrant every minute. Now, you do have some strong priority damage here, obviously, and the 2-piece is actually really strong for Demonology, so you might see a bit of a spike early on. When you get that 2-piece, you're actually going to be doing a bit more damage than some of these other specs maybe. And even the 4-piece and the double Lego isn't that bad, so definitely a decent spec in 9.2 Raid, the best Warlock spec by far, which means it's going to gain a ton of value because you need it for Hellstones, you need it for the Gate obviously. Demonology looking decent, but not quite as strong as in 9.1 I think, and definitely nowhere near the top in terms of maximum single target DPS. Next up we have one of the powerhouses of 9.2, the Warrior, and it's gonna be an absolute menace in 9.2 Raid I think. Both Arms and Fury are warranted of an S tier spot in my opinion at least. Even though Fury is gonna be a little bit stronger overall, I think it's gonna have a little bit better single target damage, better tier set, scales better with gear with the dual wield, and you also obviously have some really strong top tier single target with Fury. Arms still does really strong single target damage, it's very versatile, it can do AoE as well as single target in pretty much the same builds, and the Warrior overall in both specs has very good priority burst damage, some very strong on demand AoE as well. You just have pretty much everything you need in the Warrior, and if that wasn't enough, you're also an incredibly tanky spec as a Warrior, as well as bringing AP buff, as well as bringing Rally to the Raid. It's just so much good stuff here for the Warrior in 9.2. And especially at the top end, I suspect that the guilds will be bringing quite a few warriors this tier. Next up we have another really strong raid class in 9.2, the Rogue. And here I'm a little bit conflicted, because although some might put this in the S tier, I actually don't quite think the Rogue deserves S tier in 9.2, and I'm gonna explain myself here. First of all, we can't ignore that the Rogue is the best single target spec in the game right now, or the best single target class I should say. All three specs are doing really well in single target, and that is for one major reason, right? We have the Sylvanas daggers dropping in 9.1, which was really strong for Rogue, both in terms of doing really strong damage, but also just a high item level weapon. And that weapon is actually so strong that you'll continue wearing it into 9.2. This means that, ironically enough, the Rogue will actually be losing comparatively to the other specs, obviously, some single target damage going into 9.2. So I don't actually think the Rogue quite deserves an S tier spot. If you consider just how stackable warriors are, for example, you wouldn't want to bring 4 rogues into the tier necessarily, but you could, I think, bring 4 warriors this tier, or like 3 warriors or something. So that is why I put the Rogue in the A tier here. However, it still does really strong single target damage throughout the 9.2 patch, and I think it's definitely gonna do more damage than the Frost Mage, even though the Frost Mage might be in the same tier here at the lower end. Outlaw, I think, isn't gonna be bad. It's still gonna do some good single target damage, but in terms of borrowed power, I don't think it quite matches up to what Assassination and Sub has going for them right now. Assassination and Sub borrowed power in Raid is gonna be quite strong this tier, and they're definitely gonna be near the top of the table in terms of pure single target DPS. So all in all, looking like a pretty strong tier for Rogues, all things considered. Moving on to a class that isn't looking as strong going into 9.2 Raid, the Hunter. We have some pretty subpar single target here from both BM and Marksmanship, sadly. Now, initially I thought BM was going to be a bit better going into 9.2 Raid with better single target, maybe just a bit better tier set overall, but it turns out obviously that Marksman tier set was bugged, and once the bug is fixed, and with the Marksmanship profile as well, and with the synergy with the new Legendary and all that stuff, I actually think that Marksmanship is gonna be a bit better than BM in 9.2 Raid. The Marksmanship tier set actually also plays into Marksmanship strength with the good low target AoE burst that could actually end up being pretty relevant in a progression setting in 9.2 Raid. So you could consider pushing Marksmanship up to B tier here, but all things considered, I think both Marksmanship and BM still have such a subpar single target damage that you can't really warrant them putting them much higher than C tier. Survival is looking a little bit better because the survival tier set actually does add a bit of single target. Now, The problem with survival is a lot of other things. Mainly it's a melee spec, no survivability, no utility, so you don't really have a reason to be brought. There's also a ton of bugs with the tier set. You also have the fact that it's pretty reliant on the tier set. Without the tier set, survival is probably going to be down here in terms of single target damage as well. So no real upsides there, but the one thing survival has going for it is its single target damage is actually looking pretty decent once you have the 4-piece, and it could rival some of these specs here in the A tier and maybe even the S tier. Now, if you watch my Survival Hunter videos, you'll know that the Survival Hunter tier set is really RNG based, so if you have a bad pull, you're definitely not going to be anywhere near the A tier or the S tier in terms of damage. But if you have a really strong pull with a lot of procs, I definitely think you could do some of the best single target in the game. However, those negatives I mentioned before with the utility, survivability and all that stuff, still I think doesn't really make it a whole lot better than BM or MM, and in the first few weeks of the patch before you have your tier set, it's very likely that Survival Hunter will more be somewhere around here in terms of viability. And so begins the task that I have dreaded the coming of for so long, ranking the balanced raid in 9.2. And if you're a pesky little balanced raid sitting there at home right now snickering, we're still at the top of the raiding scene after 25 tiers of total dominance. I don't know what to say to you honestly, but you're still on top in 9.2, and I guess that's for the best, because otherwise you would probably be complaining. Now, there's a huge number of reasons for why balanced raids are so good in raid. First of all, they have really strong priority single target damage, right? You can play Ventir, you can play Kyrian, you can play Night Fae, you have really good on-demand burst, you have really good spread out AoE cleave, you have the best range in the game, you're very tanky, you can bring a ton of different moonkins, you have innervates, etc, etc. They might not be on top in terms of consistent single target over a long period of time, and they're definitely not going to be ahead by a huge margin, but they are definitely on par with the Warriors, I would say, as one of the, if not the strongest DPS of 9.2 raid. Feral Druid, that was initially looking pretty decent going into 9.2 actually, with a strong single target baseline and a pretty decent tier set, got pretty demolished by Blizzard F to the Feral Druids, because the sad truth now is that the Feral Druid tier set is actually quite dog shit in single target in 9.2, which means that even though you have a strong single target baseline, your niche, which was strong single target, actually got quite put down compared to these other specs that some of them are gaining very strong single target bonuses. And if you combine that with the fact that you don't really bring any utility or anything like that to the raid, the Feral Druid is looking pretty sad in 9.2. You also have a pretty sussy damage profile where you can pretty much only do priority damage, some funnel damage with the double Legos maybe, but you won't really be doing any big AoE bursts now with the tier set nerfed. So damage profile still suffering, single target actually maybe a little bit worse than 9.1 even, and overall I think it's not looking too good of a tier for Feral Druids. That said, Feral Druid baseline is still high enough I think for you to rival some of these S tier and A tier specs when it comes to pure single target damage. Next up we have the Shaman. I think this is actually one of the highest stonks DPS going into 9.2 because of just how fun the goddamn class is, and the Shaman is usually pretty fun in most raid tiers, but especially now with the tier set, I think Shaman is going to be incredibly fun. Elemental has a pretty damn strong single target tier set that buffs their fire ally stuff with lava burst. Their single target is not really that strong to begin with though going into 9.2, so I don't think that they're gonna be anywhere near the top in terms of pure single target DPS, but I still think they're definitely warranted of a B tier spot here because they have middle of the pack single target, they're a tanky spec, they're a good progression spec, they have an overall decent damage profile, they can do burst AoE, burst single target, they have very good consistent single target as well. I mean, okay, their burst single target is probably not very good actually now that I think about it, but pretty much every other aspect of their kit is pretty good, and they're, as I said, very tanky, very good progression spec usually, and very fun to play in 9.2. Enhancement is actually looking even stronger going into 9.2, and that's for a couple of different reasons. First of all, we have a pretty damn good single target tier set that's also really fun, that just brings their single target to a pretty decent level here I would say, maybe rivaling the specs here in A tier on its own, but then you also bring the Windfury totem, and what other specs do we have in the S tier and the A tier? A lot of warriors and rogues, which all benefit hugely from the Windfury totem. So Enhancement Shaman with its various single target gains from both Windfury totem and its good single target baseline DPS with a tier set, I think it's actually going to be very very good as a 9.2 one-off class. You can bring one of them to the raid for that Windfury totem and they will probably be the single best class in terms of value that you can bring. However, I don't think they're quite warranted of an S tier spot because they aren't quite as stackable as the warriors and the balanced druids in my opinion. I think however that they deserve to be pushed up here close to the assassination rogue. Next up we have the DK, and sadly I can't say that it's looking too strong. Similar to how Hunters and Warlocks have really subpar single target right now, the DKs are down there not doing great. And this is partly to be expected, right, because they don't traditionally scale exceptionally either maybe, but I still think that Hunters, Warlocks and DKs together could all three receive a pretty decent single target buff without being essentially too broken. So all three of these classes I think definitely deserve some tuning by Blizzard come Heroic Week. In terms of which DK spec is going to be best, I was initially a little bit hyped for Unholy because they received some buffs to their conduits, to their Abomination limb ability as well, which all in all actually kind of helped them quite a lot, and also their tier set got touched. But even with those changes, I can't actually be sure that Unholy is gonna beat out Frost in terms of single target damage, because the Frost tier set I think is overall maybe a little bit stronger than the Unholy tier set in terms of pure single target DPS. The Unholy tier set focuses a bit on that Execute niche, but I don't think the damage is particularly strong either in Execute or outside of Execute. And even something like an Affliction Warlock, even though its baseline single target is a little bit worse, I still think the Affliction Warlock beats out Unholy DK in Execute, even though Execute is supposed to be Unholy's niche. So all in all, neither of the DK specs are looking too good, but if I had to bet, I would actually say that Frost maybe pulls ahead a little bit in 9.2. Another spec that isn't looking too hot going into 9.2 is the Windwalker Monk, and here it's quite hard for me to rank Windwalker because it's always gonna have that really valuable burst profile in terms of AoE, right? So you might still bring a one-off Windwalker to deal with some big AoE packs, to deal with some ads that needs to die, or whatever it might be, and the value is still there. The tier set is pretty decent, although it's been bugged for a long time, but the big thing that the Windwalker doesn't have going for it is obviously its single target damage. I think its single target is definitely potentially even worse than some of these specs here in the C tier, but I still think its burst profile pushes it maybe to the top of C tier here. Next up, Havoc DH. Their tier set recently got reworked on the PTR, and I don't think the new version is particularly strong, but crucially, their double legendaries with Ventir and the demonic build actually has some really strong synergy and is really strong, which means that overall their single target damage in 9.2 is going to be quite good, I think. I'm not sure exactly how good if you compare it to enhancement, rogues and warriors. I'm not sure if it's quite up there, but I think all in all, with them bringing a raid buff, with them bringing darkness, being a pretty tanky, mobile, versatile melee DPS, it definitely warrants them being in the A tier. And their single target is definitely going to be at least middle of the pack, if not better, going into 9.2. One thing to note is that the Ventir build with Meta and Demonic actually has a similar profile to the Frostmage, right, where you don't really have a huge amount of peaks, you're doing pretty consistent amounts of damage, which could potentially be a downside if you compare it to some of the burstier specs down here in maybe B tier, or some of them up in S tier. We've arrived at the Shadow Priest here, and this one is going to be a little bit difficult for me to rate because the Shadow Priest just got destroyed by Blizzard on the PTR. Their single target was nerfed by quite a lot. Some Shadow Priests were saying that it was around like 7 to 10% of their single target damage, which is a huge nerf and definitely something that brings them down going into 9.2. Now, they were looking very strong. If it wasn't for that nerf, I would probably have put them somewhere in between the S and the A tier here, but with the nerf, I think that their single target is looking more comparable to some of the specs here in the B tier. And suddenly, if the Shadow Priest is doing similar in terms of single target to some of these specs, then you really start to question should it be brought, right? Because if you look at Fire Mage, Arcane Mage, Shaman, they all have really strong AoE burst, really strong damage profiles for that bursty parts of the raid fights, while as Shadow Priest is more a spread out spec, right, with really strong consistent single target, and they can't really do much if a pack of 8 mobs run in and needs to die ASAP, right? All this means that I think Shadow Priest stonks are falling a little bit in 9.2, definitely. I still think that Shadow Priest single target is going to be in the upper echelon of the specs, comparable to maybe some of the rogue specs and Havoc and Frost and stuff like that. So don't panic, but I definitely think that Shadow Priest is looking a little bit weaker than before. And finally, we have the Ret Paladin. In 9.1, I actually think it's quite decent. It has some middle of the pack single target with some good AoE burst attached to it with its profile. However, it obviously doesn't bring any major utility or survivability or mobility or anything like that. It's a melee spec, so you're never really gonna want to bring this for any particular reason other than its DPS. And in 9.2, I think it's gonna fall quite a bit in DPS because the tier set isn't really great. Now, the double Lego is quite decent, so maybe it isn't actually as terrible as I pointed out to be here, or as I make it out to be here. But all in all, I still think you're looking at the similar levels to maybe Windwalker, where you are a little bit better in single target than the Windwalker, but you're not quite as strong in the burst AoE department. That said, if the tier set actually is terrible enough for Red Paladin to fall behind even these specs, then it definitely isn't gonna be brought. So I figured I'd add some closing thoughts here as well. First of all, which classes do I think Blizzard will buff going into Heroic Week or whenever they're gonna do their tuning? And in that case, I definitely think we're talking about Warlock, DK and Hunter to the levels of maybe B tier single target or somewhere around there, right? They're still supposed to be some of the worst specs obviously in single target, that I'm okay with that, but I think they're just a little bit too far behind right now. And especially Unholy, if single target is its niche, then it should definitely be a little bit stronger than this. I think 3 specs that you also could consider moving up would be Demolock, Elemental Shaman and Shadow Priest. All of these 3 specs have pretty mediocre single target, but they're still casters, they're still bringing a lot to the raid, and in terms of demo, you definitely do need that 1 or maybe even 2 Warlocks, so all of these specs could probably in theory be pushed up to A tier if we aren't considering just pure single target DPS here. When it comes to the top of the list, the one thing that I would probably argue the most about is if Rogue should be bumped up to S tier, right? You could make the argument that both Sub and Assassination has the single target to warrant them being in S tier. The argument I make for them not being there is that they're not quite as stackable as these 3 specs here. I don't want to run into 9.2 raid with 4 sub-rogues in my group. However, I would want to run into 9.2 raid with 4 boomkins. I would actually be more than happy to do that. So I think that's the main reason why rogues are still in the A tier, as well as them being pretty reliant on that Sylvan's dagger, and they're actually gonna fall off a little bit in single target as the patch goes on, I think. Another spec you could potentially make an argument for being S tier, I think, is Enhancement, just because of Windfear Totem, right? If you compare the single target damage that Enhancement brings to these other specs, it actually beats them out by quite a bit, right? Because of that Windfear Totem. But similar to the point of the Rogue, I don't think Enhancement is quite as stackable, and also Windfear Totem is maybe more considered as a raid buff than anything else at this point. Finally, I just wanted to say that I'm probably gonna be wrong about a lot of stuff here, right? Especially in the lower end, so take everything with a grain of salt. Let me know in the comments down below what you think I rank too low or too high. Let me know what you plan to play in 9.2, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye. Huh? Oh, you're still here. Well, I'm sorry. I think you should probably go and check out a video maybe over here or somewhere here. You can even subscribe down here. That would be really, really nice. I would highly appreciate that. I'm gonna go snort some more lines. See ya.